Center for Indic Studies academic year monthly seminar series has basically three named seminar series. One is the Gandhi lecture series, other one is Pandit Ram Samuj Arya lecture series, and the third one, which we usually have either in March or April, is the Patanjali lecture series. Center for Indic Studies itself was founded in October 2001 to coincide with Gandhi's birth anniversary, and it basically aspires to be a major resource in the US for Gandhi-related scholarship and Gandhi-inspired activism. In the past, we have had speakers like Professor Uma Dupelia, Mesri, great-granddaughter of Mahatma and a Gandhi scholar at University of Western Cape, South Africa. We have had a very interesting talk by Professor Faisal Devji from Oxford University. He had a very interesting book on Gandhi. We had Professor Jean Sharp from the Albert Einstein Institution and formerly a professor at our own campus. So we basically invite speakers who in some way or other have been touched by Gandhi's philosophy, work, and life. Our this year's speaker is Kit Miller. Kit Miller has served as the director of the M.K. Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence since 2009. Let me tell you a few words about M.K. Gandhi Institute. The Institute is a non-profit that works to realize the vision of its historic namesake by helping individuals and communities create public awareness of nonviolence as knowledge critical to human thriving. It collaborates with local organizations, academic institutions, students, and committed peacemakers in the following areas: nonviolence education, sustainability, and environmental conservation, and the promotion of racial justice. Its key partner is the University of Rochester. Kit's prior position before becoming the director of this institute was as director, celebrator of Bay Area Nonviolent Communication in Oakland, California. She has been learning about and organizing for nonviolence for the past 22 years in a variety of capacities. She draws on Gandhian and Indian nonviolence as well as nonviolent communication, the work that reconnects and permaculture for direction and daily practice in her life and work. In addition to leading the institute and teaching nonviolence, she works on community projects related to restorative justice, sustainability, and race as applications of nonviolence in Rochester. Kit co-leads nonviolence retreats each year in various sites around the world. She has 3 children and is here with her husband David today. I invite Kit Miller to give the Gandhi series lecture for 2015.
Thank you all for coming. We're celebrating Gandhi's birthday, in my heart anyway, still it was a week ago today, so it's wonderful to be here with you. I'm grateful for the opportunity. The sort of pedagogical approach that we take in our work with people, and our focus especially is on people between the ages of 12 and 24. So we run daily classes in Rochester middle schools for over 100 kids every single day, working in a committed way with those kids to give them the tools, some of which I'm going to talk about with you today. We also run the conflict resolution systems in 2 area high schools, both of which are plagued with a tremendous amount of challenge and violence. One of them just across the street a month ago had a mass shooting and several kids were killed. So we're working hard in an engaged way with the community. And we also partner with college students in 2 academic institutions in particular, University of Rochester and Rochester Institute of Technology. So it's this kind of interesting experiment of a community-based nonviolence organization that's sort of perched in the edges of things. We are perched in terms of our connections with higher ed, and we're perched in terms of our work in the community. When I first arrived at the Institute in 2009, we were at that point housed in at the University of Rochester in a little corner of the Interfaith Chapel. And as I was saying earlier, as soon as I arrived there, I started agitating to be able to leave. Because for me, to be Gandhian does not mean that you get to be in a comfortable space. It means that you are as much as possible connecting with the people that you want to serve. And for me, that was the poorest people in Rochester. And Rochester is a great place to be trying to do something about nonviolence. We have high rates of violence going on there and poverty, and it's officially a hyper-segregated community according to its housing and education patterns. So it's a great place to do work and to try to understand how can nonviolence be applied in 21st century American life. I am one of 9 people that work there now, and I'm blessed to have a fantastic staff. Most of the people in my staff are in their 20s, and they are very engaged with community work. I'll show you a few of their pictures. I want to speak just also a little bit about how I got started in this work, and then I'm actually going to invite you guys also to do an interactive exercise that we've developed so that you don't just sit there. Mostly what we try to do is pretty experiential. So this is my, you can see Yehuda Miller. We're not related to each other. He grew up right down the street from where the Institute is, and he does neighborhood outreach for us now. He's especially walking around and talking to people in the neighborhood. What do we need to do to bring each other together in a neighborhood plague with a lot of violence? Next person down is my colleague Shannon. She started working with us originally as a Midnight Voluntary Service worker and now serves as our Associate Director. David Sanchez leads the team at Monroe High School in applying restorative practices and restorative justice to trying to support creating a positive conflict resolution system in a high school with a tremendous issue. So we're working hard with the Rochester City School District now on trying to move the ideas of restorative justice from just something that some buildings do to something that actually becomes a code of conduct, and I'd like to see it move to state law. How many people here are familiar with the phrase restorative justice? Okay. So I'm just going to quickly say restorative justice is a community-based response when harm or violence occurs. So instead of there being some abstract law that says who's right and who's wrong and what the punishment should be, we put the questions and we put the outcomes back into the hands of the people who are directly affected by something that's happened. So the questions move from, instead of who's right and who's wrong, who is harmed? Who is harmed? And who is affected by the harm? Next question is, what do we need to do to make things right? So we look at who is the harmed, who needs to be in the circle to talk, who is affected, what were the effects, and what do we do to make things right? If you look up, if you get interested at all in restorative justice, restorative practices, there's a lot of evidence that talks about its ability to interrupt trauma, to interrupt the school to prison pipeline. So we're very engaged with restorative practices and doing some very interesting research now, very hands-on. So David leads the team of people working on that in that particular school. Next is my colleague Malik. He's an intern with us who came up a couple years ago from Washington, D.C. and never left. And Malik and our other colleague Evan, they staff the conflict resolution room at one of the high schools in Marison and neighborhood. And it's called the Star Room, and they're writing a collection called Stories from Star, which is really interesting about just what all the conflicts that the students come in with and how fast, when you empower them, they can resolve their own conflicts. They sure don't need to be suspended and sent out of school. Last, here, my colleague Spiro, he also works every day with middle schoolers in a couple of different buildings, both of whom are really struggling with violence. Colleague Megan, who's our AmeriCorps Vista worker. Colleague Evan, who also works in the schools. My colleague Veronica, who serves as our business manager. So when I speak about the work that we do, I wanted you to see the faces of the we, because it sure isn't me, it's us. So when we do the work that we do with people of all ages, we try to move it as fast as possible to being interactive, because I know that every one of you received the same training that I did, which is that you were trained to pretend to listen, even when you weren't. I know it's probably happening right now. It's okay. I accept it. But I want to change it as much as possible and bring your attention back. So I'm going to invite you to participate in a little project that we did. We developed this a few years ago when we started trying to really think about how can we creatively share ideas about Gandhi's life in a way that matters to younger people. And even older people, they have this kind of like very sketchy idea of who Gandhi is. And because they think they know, they don't inquire more. That's the way our brains work, right? Once it thinks it knows something, it checks, it moves off. But we wanted people to circle back around and think about Gandhi in a different way. So these are cards that we wrote after having shared ideas about Gandhi with young people for a few years. The whole project actually is a project that's also trying to demonstrate Gandhian ideas about economics. Like in so many things, Gandhi was far, far ahead of his time, like 100 years, in terms of his concern around sustainability, as well as his concern around the localizing of economies. So this is a project that demonstrates a Gandhian principle called Swadeshi, which is the notion of taking care of those close to you in terms of economics. And that's becoming a new thing now. As I noticed as I came in, I saw your sustainability commitment and the idea of like that food on this campus would be locally sourced, that you think about the local economy, the local biome, and take care of the earth in a different way by even thinking about, well, where does food come from? And when we throw things away, where is away? So this is a project that's is an effort to try to embody that as well as to teach people. We sell these on Amazon, by the way. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you all a card, and I'm going to ask you to teach 2 people the content of these cards. And I'm going to do this in part because, from my understanding of the way human beings learn, we remember maybe 10, 15, 20% of what we hear. So right now, your ability to retain what I'm saying would be probably minimal. Like if I'm really good, in a few years' time, one thing I say will have stuck in your mind. You'd be like, yeah, that thing that lady said. Remember that thing back in college? Yeah, so that's as good as it gets as far as human memory goes. So I'm always interested in bumping up the percentage. I want to use our time effectively. So then I was reading, and I found out that actually we remember about 40% of what we read and learn with other people. So like if you're doing a working group in a class and you're reading together and you're talking over the concepts, that means about 40% of the knowledge will probably stick. That's better, but not great. But then I found out that actually people remember 90% of what they teach. We remember 90% of what we teach. So we actually structure a lot of our workshops, trainings, and activities now in getting people to teach as fast as they possibly can, teaching each other. And then we just get out of the way. We even now have a thing where instead of charging tuition for our trainings, the tuition for the training isn't money. It's that you go out and teach at least 2 groups within 30 days what you learned. So we're having a really different approach to thinking about how to share information with people. So I'm going to pass these out. We're going to spend just 5 minutes or so, and I'd like you to just share the content of these cards, then we're going to come back and talk about what out of these cards help you to think about a lived practice of nonviolence. So the question is, did you hear anything or did you read anything off your card to help give you a clue about a lived practice of nonviolence? A couple of hands in the back.
Yeah, where he learned nonviolence? Nonviolence, he learned from his wife.
Yeah.
Because if I recall, I think he had, it's not mentioned in the card, if I recall this history, Gandhi was very angry with his wife and threw his wife out of the house. Okay. Then she went out of the house. Next day morning when he opened the doors, the doors, he found his wife sitting there. All night she was sitting outside the house. Then he was so angry. She did not retaliate. Her retaliation was in terms of non-violence, ahimsa. So she stayed calm. Then he said, okay, come inside. Then he thought, okay, non-violence is the best weapon. So that's what he mentioned, that he learned non-violence from his wife.
Did anybody get the card on Gandhi and women? Because that's
Yeah,
one of the things that
I
he
got
talks
it.
about. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Another 1 or 2 people, something to learn about, or a clue about a lived practice of nonviolence. I'll hear from one of the students. You'll find out too, I'm good with long, uncomfortable silences. Thank you. Yeah.
So he talked about children, and what he says, like, one of the things that is we have to start children and teach them the new generation needs to know order, so teaching you like what is wrong and what is right. So the new generation is the generation. So for him, he believes that whatever we have to start with is from children.
Yeah. Yeah.
I couldn't hear it. My hearing is bad.
I can say again. Yeah. So let me. I captured. You got the card about Gandhi and children, and his firm belief that it was very important to start nonviolence education very early, to interrupt sort of the generational handing down of violence and violence that, as a mindset, even to interrupt that by teaching children. Yeah. And it's interesting because part of that awareness is why that's guided our focus to be between the ages of 12 and 24. Especially, supporting younger people with these tools and ideas. And some people say even 12, it's too late. You need to start earlier. So we're looking at kind of going down. And at the same time, adults have so much power in the world. So even if we continue to teach these ideas to younger people, we also need to make sure that the adults are supporting them, not incarcerating them for their ideas, as people have been. Anybody else? Something that you learned about from the card? Looking over at this side. Thank you.
I didn't know
You didn't know he was a vegetarian? Yep. 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 Yes. His mom was very worried when he went off to study law in England that he was going to turn into a meat eater and just fall off the path of righteousness every which way. And so he made a promise to her, a vow. And he had experimented some with eating meat when he was younger, but actually it was when he was living in London that he got really passionate and interested in diet. He played with issues around diet and health all of his life. He actually was a passionate nurse and was involved with nursing sick people both for the years he was in South Africa as well as with nursing people later on when he returned to his work in India. He was a man with many, many, many interests. Yeah, and health and diet was one. Yeah, thank you. And the notion of cultivating a lived practice of nonviolence. What does that even mean? What does that even mean? For me, it means that I'm consciously trying to integrate ideas about my values into my everyday life. That the way that I spend money, the way I transport myself, the way I speak to people, the way I interact with people, where I live, what I do, that everything relates to my values. And I try to be as conscious of that as possible. And that can never be anything but an attempt, because none of us are perfect. So I'm going to mainly speak right now about the notion of a lived practice of nonviolence in terms of how I manage myself and how I interact with other people in terms of my work life. And there's a whole other piece around how do we think about our consumption of goods, for instance, or how we transport ourselves, and how do we? I know Gandhians who don't use oil. They only live lives now where they're not consuming oil because they see it's so bad for the earth. So everybody has their own flavor of what is a lived practice of nonviolence. But I'm going to mostly speak about nonviolence in my own inner management as well as how I work with other people in relationship to it. And I came from a family with some verbal violence and physical violence growing up. So my journey with nonviolence really accelerated when I became a parent. And I realized that I had all that conditioning in there ready to come pouring out. And it was a really hard time because I got scared, basically. And I was pretty committed to not passing on some of the things that had been given to me. But I didn't know what to do. I honestly didn't have a clue. And I think that happens to a lot of people when they become parents. And then you just start out and you think you're going to be able to do better, and then our habits take us over, or overwhelm, or lack of resources, or whatever. But I was really blessed that I just was able to find the support that I needed at home to be able to start. So I studied nonviolence really just out of becoming a parent and wanting to do a better job with my kids. So that's really where I got my start. So I'm going to speak a little bit about what I think of as inner organizing. So there's inner organizing, how I organize myself in relation to the work, and then there's the outer organizing, is how I relate to other people. So I'm just going to throw out some ideas for you. One of the things I want to really highlight is I started into nonviolence also because I started to be a meditator, and when I was first in my 20s, and I started for the first time to tune into my own inner dialogue and hearing my own thoughts. And what I was really saddened by was that even when I was sort of speaking in a pretty harsh or sarcastic way out to somebody else, what was going on inside of me was always an order of magnitude worse. It was amazing how fast I could trash myself. I hope none of you know what I'm talking about. But I could hate on myself at the speed of light. And I realized, how am I going to interrupt that? So one thing I want to just put out for you is an idea is to find something that helps you to slow down your stimulus response pattern. So when something happens and your quick response is either to blame someone else or blame yourself, or do what I call being blame-dexterous, which you can blame yourself and others simultaneously. Do anything you can to slow that down. Some people, it's prayer time or meditation time or a somatic practice, like I was excited to hear about the yoga series that you guys had here. Whatever you can do that breaks that stimulus response pattern, whatever you can do to slow it down, that's going to help you to move in a direction of a lived practice of nonviolence. Does that make sense? So that's one thing I really want to put out. I don't think that we can be thoughtful about our lives and if we don't have some space in our lives where we can slow down and do that kind of self-reflection and self-connection. And Gandhi spoke about this again and again and again, as did Dr. King, that we have to turn up the volume on that still small voice within that's really the guide for our lives. Not all the externalities, but what is our heart telling us that we need to do? And the more time that we have to listen, the better chances are that we can actually direct our life according to those values. I also want to be realistic and humble about the barriers. Our habit, the speed of our lives. These are all challenged cultural narratives that educate us that violence is pleasurable and going to happen no matter what. Violence is inevitable. So there's challenges to that which I don't want to underestimate. And still, it's a challenge worth taking. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, for one of the first steps that we do when we're working with people of all ages at home, is when we talk, before we ask people to understand nonviolence, first we're going to spend a little time thinking about what violence is. Because violence and nonviolence sort of contain each other in a way. And one of the things that's been helpful for me to think about is that when I ask a group of people, what do you think of as violence? And they say things like murder, assault, war. I think of all of those things actually as secondary effects of violence. That's the downstream consequences of two other things behind it. One of the upstream pieces is the internal work that I just talked about. So the internal violence, the internalized structures of violence that we have inside of us. So there's the internal work that needs to be done. And then there's a tremendous amount of structural violence that goes on in the world. There's the violence of poverty, the violence of racism, the violence of war. And these are the things that Dr. King talked about as the triple threat. The things that we really needed to address. The structures of violence. Most of the interpersonal violence that I'm aware of in the world is a downstream consequence of those two things. But when you listen to leaders talk about how to deal with violence, they're mostly talking about the secondary effects. So if you're only trying to solve a problem at the secondary effects level, what do you think that does? Is it going to do anything? I don't think so. It actually perpetuates it in a way. Because then people get more hopeless and they think, well, there's nothing that can be done. Only hand my power over. Nothing can be done about the violence. Nothing can be done. And I don't believe that that's true. My favorite definition of structural violence, by the way, is from a philosopher named Zizek, who said, structural violence is the smooth functioning of our current systems. And I saw a lot of that. I was blessed to go to South Africa and study nonviolence for a couple of weeks this past summer with two of my young colleagues. And I saw how similar the structural violence in South Africa is to the violence where I live. The color breakdown, who rides and who walks, who owns, who rents, who lives where. So we have a lot of work to do on the structural end of things, and we can't divorce it from the internal work. So I'm going to say some of the kind of clues that I've gotten over the years of how do I manage myself and other people in a way that actually manifests nonviolence. One principle is something that I like to talk about, is that life is a learning laboratory. It's not a performance. So I'm not here just to perform for other people. I'm here to learn. I'm primarily a learner. And I've read some great stuff about how curiosity is a meta skill of nonviolence. So for instance, when someone says or does something that you don't like, instead of moving to judgment and dismissing them and dehumanizing them, you can instead get curious. What was it? What made this person do this thing? Even the thing that you really can't bear. Let's look for the underlying motivation. The work of nonviolent communication and Marshall Rosenberg's work has been a very useful strategy for me in doing that really difficult work of separating the doer from the deed. But we have to do that, because when we dehumanize somebody, when I say, oh, that person there, they just come in every meeting and trash talk and waste everybody's time. If we dehumanize people in that way, or if we dehumanize groups of people, then that's the first step to violence. Because we can't really do violence to people whose humanity we regard with as much care as our own. So we have to do the work of looking at people and figuring out how to love. I heard Tavis Smiley speak a couple of years ago for Dr. King's birthday. And he talked about, you can't lead if you don't love. So we have to learn how to love. And for me, this has been one of the ways in which I do it. When people often act in ways that break my heart, or ways in which I can't even comprehend, I have to do the hard work of figuring out what is it that led them to make those choices. I need to understand. I have to separate the doer from the deed. It's my responsibility as a person who's trying to live nonviolence in the world. Another thing that I've really liked and want to talk a little bit about is how important it is to work with people whose perspectives are different from your own. When we're in a space where we're convinced that we're the only one who knows, or we're convinced that our ideas are the ones that have to come forward, I regard that now as a sign for myself that my own internal resilience is low. When I'm in a good space, when I have the resources that I need to be able to work effectively with other people, I actually really enjoy and welcome ideas that are really different from mine. If a bunch of people who are really different from each other in terms of their perspectives, the way they think, their ages, their religions, their races come together and work on a project, and we can work an idea through our group, that's a strong idea. So you saw from some of the different kinds of people even that I work with, a lot of different ages, races, religious backgrounds, and that's how we work as a team. And that's not an easy thing to do, so which goes back to that being able to separate the doer from the deed. It's easier for us to hang around with people who think like us. And I'd like to challenge you to be willing to actually engage purposefully, meaningfully with people who think differently than you. A lot of rich stuff can come out of that. I want to put a note out. Has anybody in here heard of a discipline called permaculture? Great, yeah. Permaculture is kind of a combined word called permanent culture. I think of it as like a nonviolent design system. It was developed by a couple of Australians, I think in the 80s, who were studying forests and realized that forests were self-containing systems, that nobody had to bring in anything for a forest to survive, and no garbage had to be taken out for the forest. So they thought, I wonder if you could figure out a way to make human systems be more resilient and self-sustaining like forests are. So they, from that, evolved a whole bunch of principles, nonviolence, or permaculture principles. And I think of this actually as also applied nonviolence. There's a lot of connections between them. If any of you are interested in sustainability, permaculture is now used globally as a way to deal with issues. For instance, in Liberia after the Civil War, and in Cuba after peak oil happened and Russia collapsed and they didn't have any external oil, permaculturists moved into both Cuba and in Liberia to help people have a different kind of perspective on what to do to resolve some of the problems. So permaculture is a very interesting way of thinking systemically, thinking nonviolently. One of the permaculture principles is edge effect, which is basically where two different things meet each other is where the most creativity, the most richness comes in, like where forests meet fields. That's where the most number of species will be. Or in the ocean, where the shallow water hits the deep, that's where people fish. The most life in the ocean is where the shallow, warm water hits the deep, cold water. Places where the edges are, those actually have a place of a tremendous amount of creativity. I think of conflicts between people as a kind of human edge effect. So instead of thinking about conflict as a bad thing that we need to get rid of, I actually think of it as a potential resource. And for me, nonviolence isn't a way to prevent conflict, it's a way to conduct conflict. It's not getting rid of conflict. Conflict occurs when people whose voices have been marginalized speak up. Conflicts occur when people are actually safe enough to have a different opinion than someone who's in power. So actually, I'm excited to be around conflict. So one of the things that we need to do in order to feel safe and okay to be around conflict is you have to get your own operating instructions down. You have to get to know your own anger. You have to get to know your own discomfort. Where this country, and certainly in the family I was raised in, we're super conflict averse. You know, hating conflict, do anything to avoid it. But I'd like to challenge you to think about a lived practice of nonviolence includes a willingness to get to know conflict inside of yourself and then around you so that you can be more useful. It's so helpful to not be afraid of my own anger and other people's anger. I got a lot of stories of being able to walk up to people who are losing it at different sites and being able to just stand next to them and be helpful to them. It's like a very rich thing to know how to do. And the cool thing is that there's constant opportunities for practice. So even if you decide to ignore me and take this up in a couple of years, don't worry, you'll find an angry person you can work with or work with your own. One other thing I want to say about anger. I actually don't think of anger as a primary feeling. I think of it like violence itself, or like a lot of the kinds of forms of violence, as a secondary effect. Most people, I believe, actually anger is the result of some other feeling that gets so intense so quickly that you end up experiencing it as anger, like frustration or fear. I got called in to work with some kids in a school the day after September 11th, 2001 happened. And we were just a few hours from New York City. So it was a big time. People were still not knowing who was dead and who was alive down there. It was very scary. So I was asked by a school to go in and speak with the kids the next day. And I had 20 minutes with each class. And I thought, what am I going to do? Let's talk about anger. So I went in and I said, I want to give you guys some information about anger so you can go out and be helpful in your world. It doesn't matter that you're 10. The world needs you. So let me ask you this question. A little kid runs out in the middle of the road and almost gets hit by a car. Just misses it. The caregiver, mom, dad, big brother, big sister, grandma, whoever, grabs him, brings him back over to the side of the road, to the sidewalk, and says, don't ever do that again, in a very loud voice. What's going on with this person? They sound very, very angry, but what's going on?
Scared.
They're scared. So one of your attentional homework assignments, if you choose to accept it, is to, when you leave here and you start paying attention to people's anger, start getting curious about it. When I'm around angry people now, I'm not so scared of them because my guess is that they are scared themselves or just deeply frustrated. Anger doesn't happen for things that you don't care about. So and now when I get angry, like the question I put on myself is, what am I caring deeply about that I don't know what to do to change? That's the only time I get angry now, is when I've hit that intersection of helplessness and caring. If I know what to do, I don't get angry. If I don't care, I don't get angry. But if I care a lot and I don't know what to do, that's when anger rises in me. Get to know your own anger, and it's such a useful skill on the road. I highly recommend it. when people bring me feedback about things, things not going well, I take it as a gift. It's so great to be someone who can be a manager or in a leadership role, and people that work with you, that are around you, they know that you genuinely want to hear the feedback. And every one of you is going to be a leader in your lives. If nothing else, you may choose to become parents. So be someone who can receive difficult feedback and be grateful for it. Now, I don't want to say that my first thought when someone sits down in my office and say, I don't like the way you said that thing at staff meeting yesterday. My first thought is not still, even after all this practice, it's still not, oh, good, all the time. But my second or my third thought is, phew, what a brave thing this person's doing right now, bringing me this feedback. They don't have to. Thank you. So I go with my second or my third reaction with a lot of these things, not my first. My first is still a condition. What's wrong with you? But my second and my third is, thank you. How can I learn if I don't get feedback? I want tight feedback loops. We need them in our world. I mean, we need them in every way we can. It's just like when you don't know how much money is in your bank account, you keep spending. Or think about like if you didn't have a tight feedback loop called your nervous system, so that when you touch something hot and it didn't quickly tell you that your hand was burning. We need tight feedback loops, even socially and emotionally between us. And not being afraid of conflict is a way to achieve that. I think if you care about the world, then one thing that we need to do is to become less afraid of being grief-struck, less afraid of being sad. Because there's so many things. The world is so much different than how I would want it to be for each and every one of you. I mean, it just breaks my heart. There's stuff that breaks my heart every day. So one of the things that I felt like I had to do in order to stay alive, not just kind of faking it, but really like able to be present in my life and useful in the world, is I needed to learn how to grieve. And I want to tell you some of the things that I found out from a very difficult time when my daughter died a few years ago, when I was really like trying to talk myself into being willing to stay alive. I want to tell you some of the things I found out about grief, because maybe someday you'll have a kind of grief that you don't know how to, you're not sure you can survive it. So here's some of the things I found out. I don't believe what I think between midnight and 5 o'clock in the morning anymore. If I'm having a thought in the middle of the night, I wait until 9 a.m. If it's still there, I pay attention to it then. But in the middle of the night, for me, that's when my darkest, hardest thinking goes on. My sense of that I can't change anything, can't do anything. So I want to give myself permission. If it's still with me at 9 o'clock in the morning, then I'll pay attention to it. But if it's just a thought that rolls around between 2, 3, 4 o'clock, I'm going to just let it be my brain doing its thing, generating thoughts. I recommend that you know what offers you solace, even on your hardest days. On my hardest days, I carry a little piece of paper around with me that helps me to remember why I'm glad to be alive. And I'll bet every one of us has maybe a similar yet different list of what makes us glad to be alive. Know what those things are. So on the days when you're not really willing to be here, there's something that pulls you back. One of the things for me in the wintertime, especially that year after my daughter died, was just flowers in bright colors. So you'll see, if you ever come to visit us at Gandhi House, I mean, the walls are so bright because I just can't stand dim colors anymore. They make me too depressed. So the colors in this room made me happy as soon as I walked in. And I used to go to this florist in the middle of the wintertime and just stand there and stare at the flowers until I could walk away. So know for yourself what nourishes you. Because if you're going to be willing to work on social change in the world, you're going to have your heart broken. No two ways about it. We have so much work to do. Things are so different than I would want it for any of us. So we have to learn how to survive our heartbreak and not get numb, but still be willing and happy to be alive in the midst of it. Is this making any sense for people? Just a few more things, and then I'm going to let you go. I know we're getting close. I want to say that grief and my thoughts about grief are not the same thing. So I think of grief as like weather. It's painful, but it's weather. It doesn't last. My thoughts about grief are what sustain it. So if I'm still thinking about grief, like after I've had that cloud burst of tears about this painful thing, this person's death, and in the work that I do, we just had a kid who was shot and killed, who was just at Gandhi House for a couple days before doing youth police dialogues. Our neighbor across the street from us was shot and killed last year. I mean, when you interact with people who are struggling in the world, you are going to be someone who has to know how to deal with grief. Figure out how to get good at it. One of the things that I've really learned a lot about and gotten really interested in is the whole issue of privilege. And I do a lot of workshops now at home for people thinking about how do we use our privilege in the world as a source of power and medicine. Because mostly people want to act like they don't have privilege. What do you mean I don't have privilege? But I'm actually excited to claim all the kinds of privilege that I have. And I'm always making up new kinds of privilege that I don't even think other people think of. I think it's a privilege to have work that you love. A lot of folks just do work because they need to, because they got to put cash in the checking account to get their family's needs taken care of. I'm so privileged because I do work that I love. If I wouldn't want another job, that's a form of privilege. There's all different kinds of privileges that we have. And one of the things that's easy for us to do is to think we can do a quick inventory of the privilege of everybody around us and act like we don't have it ourselves. So one of the things that I recommend people do to cultivate a lived practice of nonviolence is to get aware of what is my own privilege profile. Every one of us has it. Maybe we're able-bodied. Whatever it is, there's a whole list. Some of the forms of privilege that we have are relatively fixed. In general, women are going to be paid less than men in the world, and so that's a fixed form of privilege. But in some settings, it's still better to be a woman than a man. In general, brown and black people in this country have a harder time in almost every single way than people who walk around in skin this color, in general. But in some settings where I work, actually the fact that I'm this color means I don't have credibility. Look for where your privilege is and get acquainted with it. Because if you don't know what it is, if you don't know what your privilege is, then when you have a lot of it, you're probably more likely to abuse it. And this happens with people when they get power in the world a lot. So I think one of the things I want to urge you to do as you go out and become powerful leaders in the world is to get to know what your own privilege is, what your rank profile is, if you will. I want to reference a book that I use a lot in teaching at home in case any of you guys are interested in these ideas. It's by a guy named Arnold Mindell, M-I-N-D-E-L-L. He and his wife Amy have written some fantastic stuff about privilege and rank. Rank being the sum of all of our privileges. And they talk about that rank is a drug. The more you have of it, the more you want. And that you're completely, most of us are unconscious of the rank that we have. So I love using my rank as medicine in the world instead of being unconscious of it. Like one example, there's a coffee shop near where I work, and I'm always mystified why the high school kids who work down the street don't use the coffee shop. But I finally figured out that the owners of the coffee shop chase those kids out when they come. So a while ago, I went into the coffee shop and I noticed a cup of coffee. I was grabbing a cup of coffee and I noticed a couple of the high school kids sitting in the corner. And I was like, oh sweet, some kids are actually in here using this coffee shop. Good, right? Then I noticed a couple of police officers coming around the corner. I thought, oh, they're going to chase. So I thought, I'm going to play with my privilege here. So I walked over and sat down next to the kid and started chatting them up like I knew them, and they're looking at me like, who is this lady? And the police officer came around the corner, and he stopped and he looked at me, and I looked at the officer and I said, excuse me, can I help you? I was using my privilege in that moment to put that guy back on his heels a little bit, because he was ready to just go in there and say, you're not welcome in here, even though the two had a cup of coffee in front of them. Learn your rank profile, learn about your privilege, and learn how to use it well in the world. It can be medicine. It's not something to be gotten rid of. You know, people are often saying to me, well, I want to overcome my privilege. I'm like, you can't. It just is. It's just a thing. It's not a thing that you deserve. It's such a thing you got handed. And it's circumstantial, too. Like in the board meetings at the Gandhi Institute. When we're talking about finances and fundraising, all the young members of our board are pretty quiet. There's not so much to say. Next item on the agenda, social media. The rank flips in the room. The older people who had all sorts of things to say about finance and fundraising get completely quiet. And the young ones are like, no, don't do that, do this, we gotta do that, we gotta do that. They have it, they got it. So use and think about where you can use your rank and privilege in the world for good. Use it for healing. Gandhi messed with privilege and rank in some amazing ways. Think about it. He was the most powerful person in his country, but he dressed like the poorest. He ate like the poorest. He traveled like the poorest. Think about what it would be like if people who were in the U.S. Congress and U.S. Senate decided to live in the poorest neighborhoods of the districts that they served. If they rode Greyhound, if they took the train to Washington, what would it mean if people who had a lot of rank and privilege did what Gandhi did? It would be revolutionary. It's just one of the many, many ways in which I admire him and his choices. Just think about what it would mean. I know all of you are going to go out and be those kind of people in the world. So I hope that some of these things that I said support you to be able to work with your life in ways that are really profound and meaningful. I'm going to leave you with a quote. It's a quote that's at the back door of the Gandhi House by Dr. Martin Luther King. And one of my young colleagues set up a listening booth and took it away. He wrote, "What are your thoughts on listening?" We do these tables up and down the street where the Gandhi House is, just to engage with neighbors. What are your thoughts on listening? Especially after the shooting that just happened in our neighborhood, we wanted people to not feel so alone with it. So everything gets repurposed where I work. But the back of it is the quote I wanted to share with you today. This is from Dr. King. "If humanity is to progress, Gandhi is inescapable. He lived, thought, and acted, inspired by the vision of humanity evolving toward a world of peace and harmony. We may ignore him at our own risk." Thank you.